Good morning, good day, and good evening to all our attendees joining us for today's latest Data Science Central webinar. I'd like to first of all thank Tableau Software for sponsoring today's event. Tableau is a wonderful supporter of the Data Science Central community, and we are honored once again to have them sponsoring our event today. I'd also like to briefly mention and show our appreciation for some of our other recent sponsors, including Actuate, Teradata, Tibco, Pivotal, Hortonworks, and VoltDB, to name just a few. All of these webinars are available on datasciencecentral.com, and if you have not had the opportunity to view them, I would encourage you to do so, as they do provide some very useful industry information. Today's webinar is entitled 7 Things We Can Learn from the Pioneers of Data Visualization. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly review the format of today's webinar. Today's event will be 1 hour long. We have a single panelist that I'll introduce to all of you in just a few moments. We should have about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A following the presentation, and as always, this event will be taped and is available later on this afternoon at datasciencecentral.com. I'd also like to encourage our attendees to provide questions throughout the presentation. We will be reviewing them and presenting them on your behalf with the time remaining. My name is Tim Madison. I'm one of the co-founders of Data Science Central, and I will be your host for today's event. I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Ben Jones of Tableau Software. Ben is an engineering and business graduate, where he received his degrees from UCLA and California Lutheran University. He is currently working for Tableau Software, managing the Tableau public product. Previously, Ben was a process improvement expert at a medical device company in Los Angeles and has a background in engineering and business. He is also an active blogger on the topic of data visualization, and you can read his blog at dataremixed.com. Again, that site is dataremixed.com. Data visualization has a rich and detailed history. The challenges faced by the early pioneers of data visualization are still very relevant today. The ways they were solved back then, again, are also still relevant today. In this webinar, you will learn how those solutions can be applied to your own work, helping you make clear, engaging, and valuable charts and dashboards. So with that, Ben, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can begin your presentation whenever you're ready.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Tim. And hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm excited about the session today. The reason is because you can learn a lot from people who went before. And so I just want to real quickly give you a heads up. If you want to participate on social media, you can just use this hashtag DataVisOldies. And those are the Twitter accounts associated with the people that are putting on this presentation today. That's mine, Data Remixed, Data Science Central, and Tableau. So I just recently moved from Los Angeles up here to Seattle to join Tableau Software. That was about a year ago. And I spent most of my life in the Los Angeles area, where there is a really awesome oldies radio station called K-Earth 101. Now, when I was a little boy, I didn't like listening to that station. I more or less had to, because that's the one my parents chose. But now in my older years, I've come to appreciate just how great some of those songs are. And so I'm going to make some analogies today as we go through these 7 pioneers. We're going to make a dedication to each one of them from the song tracks that we all kind of know and love. And the goal really is just to kind of lighten it up and have some fun with this, because history is a subject that some people struggle with, and I think that I understand that. When you're in high school, you have to learn a lot of different things about what happened in the past, and that can be not fun. But I think this is great, because the point here and what we're going to go about doing today isn't to just think about what happened in the past, but to apply lessons to today. And so I'm going to try to also introduce some thoughts that I have about how what these people did in their lives is incredibly applicable to what we're doing right now, actually today in our day and age. So being that I'm from Los Angeles, I'm going to refer you to one
Good morning, good day, and good evening to all our attendees joining us for today's latest Data Science Central webinar. I'd like to first of all thank Tableau Software for sponsoring today's event. Tableau is a wonderful supporter of the Data Science Central community, and we are honored once again to have them sponsoring our event today. I'd also like to briefly mention and show our appreciation for some of our other recent sponsors, including Actuate, Teradata, Tibco, Pivotal, Hortonworks, and VoltDB, to name just a few. All of these webinars are available on datasciencecentral.com, and if you have not had the opportunity to view them, I would encourage you to do so, as they do provide some very useful industry information. Today's webinar is entitled 7 Things We Can Learn from the Pioneers of Data Visualization. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly review the format of today's webinar. Today's event will be 1 hour long. We have a single panelist that I'll introduce to all of you in just a few moments. We should have about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A following the presentation, and as always, this event will be taped and is available later on this afternoon at datasciencecentral.com. I'd also like to encourage our attendees to provide questions throughout the presentation. We will be reviewing them and presenting them on your behalf with the time remaining. My name is Tim Madison. I'm one of the co-founders of Data Science Central, and I will be your host for today's event. I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Ben Jones of Tableau Software. Ben is an engineering and business graduate where he received his degrees from UCLA and California Lutheran University. He is currently working for Tableau Software, managing the Tableau public product. Previously, Ben was a process improvement expert at a medical device company in Los Angeles and has a background in engineering and business. He is also an active blogger on the topic of data visualization, and you can read his blog at dataremixed.com. Again, that site is dataremixed.com. Data visualization has a rich and detailed history. The challenges faced by the early pioneers of data visualization are still very relevant today. The ways they were solved back then, again, are also still relevant today. In this webinar, you will learn how those solutions can be applied to your own work, helping you make clear, engaging, and valuable charts and dashboards. So with that, Ben, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can begin your presentation whenever you're ready.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Tim. And hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm excited about the session today. The reason is because you can learn a lot from people who went before. And so I just want to real quickly give you a heads up. If you want to participate on social media, you can just use this hashtag DataVisOldies. And those are the Twitter accounts associated with the people that are putting on this presentation today. That's mine, Data Remixed, Data Science Central, and Tableau. So I just recently moved from Los Angeles up here to Seattle to join Tableau Software. That was about a year ago. And I spent most of my life in the Los Angeles area, where there is a really awesome oldies radio station called K-Earth 101. Now, when I was a little boy, I didn't like listening to that station. I more or less had to, because that's the one my parents chose. But now in my older years, I've come to appreciate just how great some of those songs are. And so I'm going to make some analogies today as we go through these 7 pioneers. We're going to make a dedication to each one of them from the song tracks that we all kind of know and love. And the goal really is just to kind of lighten it up and have some fun with this, because history is a subject that some people struggle with, and I think that I understand that. When you're in high school, you have to learn a lot of different things about what happened in the past, and that can be not fun. But I think this is great, because the point here and what we're going to go about doing today isn't to just think about what happened in the past, but to apply lessons to today. And so I'm going to try to also introduce some thoughts that I have about how what these people did in their lives is incredibly applicable to what we're doing right now, actually today in our day and age. So being that I'm from Los Angeles, I'm going to refer you to one of my favorite movies of all time, and that movie is The Dead Poets Society with Robin Williams, who I think is one of the best actors that I've ever had the pleasure of watching on the big screen. So Robin Williams plays this English teacher, John Keating, in this old boarding school in England. And this film came out in 1989. So he's just now joining the school for the very first time, and this is his first day of class, and the boys are a little befuddled when he walks into his English poetry class in the front door, walks right down the aisleway and out the back door whistling a tune, and they all look at each other a little bit puzzled, and then some of them gather their books and get up and follow him out into the hallway. And in the hallway, he sees them come out and join him, and there are all these photographs lined up on the wall, these old black and white photographs. You've seen the ones I'm talking about, where there's a football player in some leather helmet, and they're all crouching down staring at the camera, probably not smiling because for some reason they didn't smile back then when someone took their picture. But in any case, he makes them lean in, and he has this kind of haunting sort of motivational scene where he whispers in their ear, and he says things like, "They're not that different from you, are they? They believe they're destined for great things, just like many of you. Their eyes are full of hope, just like you." And then he says, "If you listen real close, you can hear them whisper their legacy to you." And then he uses these three words, which we all hear quite often, right? Carpe diem, seize the day, in this haunting, haunting voice. So it's a great scene, and they're all kind of weirded out and a little bit confused as to what in the world this guy's doing. But what he's doing is real simple. He's trying to help them understand that the lives of the people that went before you are very relevant to you. And for better or worse, one day, you'll be the photograph on the wall too, and someone else will be seeing what you did. And so there's your motivation, right? What are you going to do to leave a legacy for the people that come after you? And so here are our photographs on the wall for today. We're going to look at 7 data visualization pioneers. These are people who laid the groundwork for how it is that we visualize data today. Now, the first thing you're going to notice as you take a look at this slide is that, wait a minute, there are only 6 photographs. Where's the 7th? Well, that's a little bit of a mystery, and we'll leave that for later, because our 7th and final data visualization pioneer is one that history almost forgot. And so we'll kind of maybe have a little bit of a surprise there toward the end of the session. But you can see these first 6 are people that you'll probably recognize, some faces that you've seen before in the pictures. Okay, so that is the session here. We've got about an hour or 40 minutes to do it, as Tim mentioned, and then we'll break up into Q&A. So definitely, as as I go along, feel free to type in your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll vote them up, and we'll see which ones we get around to. Let's start. Now, the first one is, we're going to start it and go in chronological order. So this isn't in any order other than starting from the farthest back in time and then coming up to the closest. And just a word on that, we're not going to really consider anyone in the past 100 years. There definitely could be a whole nother presentation, and maybe we'll think about that, where you'd look at modern day data visualization heroes. But this is really focusing on the ones from the more distant past. Our first data visualization pioneer is a man by the name of Christoph Scheiner. Christoph was a Jesuit who looked to the heavens, and we're going to learn an important lesson from him. Actually, of all the people in the slide deck in the presentation today, he's the first one that is, I guess you would call it a negative lesson, so what not to do. So a background on Christoph Scheiner. So Christoph was born in the 1500s, so 1575, in present-day Germany. It was at that time part of the Holy Roman Empire. He was a Jesuit. He studied theology, and he was a part of the Jesuit order. And he joined the Jesuit order at 22 years old. And he was involved in academia, so he studied at university in Ingolstadt, where he really focused on metaphysics and math. Now, to compare him to people you probably know in our day and age, he was a gadget guy, so he loved instrumentation. He became an expert in the math of sundials at a really early age. He almost became famous, or like a celebrity, because of what he did with sundials, as well as this really cool, ingenious invention that he came up with called the pantograph. We do copy-paste and scale images up and down all the time, so we take this for granted. But back then, there was this need to be able to scale up an image, say maybe a floor plan of an architectural building or something like that, either larger or smaller. And this was this contraption that could do that for you just by, you can imagine, kind of putting the points and aligning them and drawing the exact same diagram at a much larger scale. So again, he sort of was able to sort of attain this celebrity status within his community, and so he sort of had a blank check to do a lot of the research that he wanted to do. So when he found out in 1610 that there was this Italian named Galileo Galilei, and he was using this brand new gadget called a telescope. He had to have his own, so he got it. He got his hands on one. First thing he did was he verified most of Galileo's observations, and so he just sort of learned the tool and how to use it, and again kind of went through and made sure that everything that Galileo did made sense and was correct, and so that was great. He learned a lot doing that. The next thing he did, since again, remember he was a guy who was really fascinated by sundials, so what he did next was the logical thing. He pointed this telescope at the sun, and obviously he had a mechanism not to blind himself, right? But he looked at the sun. He was fascinated by the sun, and he pointed his telescope right at the sun. Now, when he did that, he noticed something that fascinated him. He wasn't the first to notice this about the sun, and he wasn't even the first to publish his findings about it. But what he came across was this notion of sunspots. So he found these tiny little markings on the surface or close to the surface of the sun. So again, he sort of continued to focus, and for the next couple decades, he observed sunspots ad nauseum, and he published this amazing book, Rosa Ursina, in 1630 that became actually the standard work on this subject for over a century. So that was great. He learned a lot, and he observed, and he recorded what he observed, and we're going to see what he did to visualize that. In fact, let's take a look at it now. When he tried to visualize sunspots, he created something that is known today as small multiples, and it's a very powerful technique to be able to show how something changes across time or across different aspects of a specific subject. You can see all these tiny little circles here in his book showing this progression of these sunspots across the surface. You can see that they don't stay in the same place. He observed that they would move across, and they would kind of not be stationary. So he made this amazing sort of book, and he, charted this subject in incredible detail. Again, a technique that if you see today, there's plenty of examples today of small multiples. Tufte spoke of them highly, and they're very, very effective. You can, at a glance, see a lot of different things going on. Here's another shot from this same book, Rosa Ursina in 1630. Again, showing how a sunspot moved along across the surface. So great, awesome. This is why he is one of the pioneers of data visualization. Fascinating, and we love his work here, and it's just great work. And the echoes of this creation of his lives on to the day. But, and this is where I guess we learn the biggest lesson from Christoph. Sunspots actually presented him with a really big problem. They weren't exactly very convenient to him. Why is that? Well, his theology dictated that the heavens and everything in them were 100% perfect. So the surface of the sun couldn't have some blemish or object on it. It was a pure golden orb of magnificence. This notion of some kind of a pockmark on the surface of the sun was very disturbing for the individuals in the church that he interacted with. So he theorized then, he postulated that sunspots had to be something other than imperfections on the sun's surface itself. So he rationalized that there must be these satellites that are orbiting the sun. And somehow what you're seeing is dark spots that are shadows or some kind of blockage of light resulting from these satellites that are going around the surface of the sun. Probably other perfect bodies as well, right? And so he fought tooth and nail with Galileo about this. And Galileo said, very simply, your theory makes no sense because sometimes these objects come and go. Sometimes they appear. Sometimes they disappear. They don't seem to follow necessarily a perfectly straight line. So Galileo argued with evidence that there was some observations that weren't consistent with Scheiner's theory that sunspots are shadows. So, big problem. Now, so Scheiner kind of retreated, and he lived this life of seclusion trying to refute Galileo. Actually, he continued his fight against Galileo into other subjects like the Copernican theory, where the sun is at the center of the solar system, and he argued the opposite. In fact, he sort of, let's take a look at his final life's work, actually published after he died, and see how tragic this is. This is the title of his last work, published posthumously in 1650. Introductory treatise in favor of a moving sun and a stable earth against Galileo Galilei. So clearly, Scheiner was on the wrong side of history. Clearly he was, very biased, and he allowed his preconceived notions about the world to color exactly what it is that he saw and the conclusions that he made. So my dedication to this fine man is the following song. Actually, this is one of my favorite songs by Simon and Garfunkel. So I'm going to slightly tweak the quote. Bear with me here. A man, this is from The Boxer, a man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest of the data. So that's Scheiner for you. So unfortunately, he was biased, and we're all biased, right? We all bring to the table our own preconceived notions about what should and shouldn't be, what would be convenient to us, what would be difficult for us. And this is a big problem with data analysis. This is something that is a force we have to actively combat. So we almost have to realize right away what our biases are and do our best to check them at the door. If not, we are at risk of falling into the same fate as Christoph Scheiner, coming up with great charts and graphs and techniques, but letting those yield the entirely incorrect and wrong conclusions. So that's our first lesson, and again, it's going back the furthest in time. Let's consider another lesson here, and let me just push the slide back over. So we're going to consider, that's lesson number 1, explore with an open mind, or don't be on the wrong side of history. Next is Joseph Priestley. Well, Joseph Priestley, what can I say about this guy? I consider myself to be maybe an overachiever or an ambitious person. Probably many of you do too. This guy is going to make you break out into a cold sweat when you consider what it is that he accomplished in his life. It's amazing. He was a master of many disciplines. So consider the following. Priestley, so we're going back to the 1700s now. So we're jumping ahead in time about a little over 100 years. So, and we're also heading west from Germany into England, in fact, to Leeds in the present-day UK. He was born in the 1700s, 1733 to be exact, and he was fluent in 6 languages. He authored 500 books and pamphlets, and he's widely credited with discovering this little thing that kind of matters to life on the planet called oxygen. He was the first to isolate it in its gaseous state. He was also the inventor of carbonated soda water, so the thing that puts beer in bubbles in beer and soda. I mean, this is sort of something that we enjoy, maybe a little bit too much in Western culture, but he was the one who invented that. He was a fanatical electrical hobbyist, so he came up with all type of amateur machinery for people who are experimenting with electronics. He also was a dissenting clergyman, so he was very involved, as well as Scheiner, in religious matters. And he was a person who had sort of some controversial beliefs about God, and so in England he was not a popular character for that reason. He actually had his house and laboratory burned to the ground by an angry mob one day, and because of all of this persecution, he fled to the Americas, where he became friends with the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson being one of them. He lived the rest of his life in America, where he interacted with the founding fathers of the United States. So here's what he said. Consider all that I just said about what he did, and we haven't even gotten to why he's important in data viz. And here's what he said. This is a quote from Priestley, which, again, just really, to me, is amazing. I never read the life of any important person without discovering that he knew more and could do more than I could ever hope to know or do in half a dozen lifetimes. Well, if that's true of Priestley, I'd hate to say how many lifetimes it would take for me to accomplish what the people that he read accomplished. So really fascinating. This guy, again, he wouldn't be watching reality TV if he lived in our day and age. He did a lot. Again. So a fascinating person. So what was his claim to fame in the data viz world? Well, he was he was moral about the importance of history. So he's kind of like that high school teacher we all had, who lectured us on how important history was, that we would, if we didn't learn the past, we were doomed to repeat the errors of the past. He moralized knowledge, and to him, it wasn't so much about preventing these follies and repeating them. Actually, it was more of a positive spin on history. He wanted, and he believed that an era of prosperity would be ushered in, if mankind would only embrace and know and understand the breadth of history. So history was a big deal for him. In fact, it was so important that, way ahead of his time, he sought to teach people, not just men, women, he taught children, he taught everyone he could about the history of civilization. He spoke highly of his wife. Again, this is in the 1700s, right? So he spoke highly of his wife for being a woman who was very intelligent, right? So these are the things that he prized. Well, what does someone who values history create? Well, they create the first known line chart. This is a timeline, and what it shows, if you look closely, is it shows on the x-axis years. This is time on the x-axis, and that seems like something that's so obvious to us, and we don't know of any time before that anyone ever did this. He was a pioneer. He was the first one to put time on the x-axis in regular intervals and show the lives of people in this way. Every line that you see here, every horizontal line, is the life of a person. This is a Gantt chart. This is exactly what this is. And you see Pythagoras, for example, on the left-hand side, stretching across in time, and you see all of these other individuals. This is just a snippet of it. It was just a massive, massive chart of biography that was intended to be sort of put on a wall and looked at. And so here's another one. If we take a look at another chart of history where he colored in the bands here of the different civilizations over time. So he loved history. This was something to him that was so important. He sought he thought about trying to educate people in his life and people in his society about history, and created these just fascinating and very impactful line charts and Gantt charts and essentially showing time. So the lesson that I have, that I take at least from Priestley, other than showing time visually, which is really powerful, but the other lesson is to educate people. This was his whole life's mission, was to educate people. The reason why he made the visualizations he made was to educate people, was so that they would know and learn and understand, and to get better. That was his underlying motivation. So the question I have, right, is our goal to help make things better by sharing insights about the world with others? Do we see data visualization as a means to educate, whether it's in our job or in groups that we're involved with, causes that we support? Are we seeking to see the big picture, or are we stuck in minutia? Or are we trying to fight over sort of agendas and so forth? This is something that is really important. It's really kind of why we do what we do. So, next dedication. What song would I dedicate to this educator? Well, let me switch over here, and it's a song by Jule Atkins, and you'll probably know it. Let me tell you about the birds and the bees and the flowers and the trees and the moon up above and a thing called data. Now, I definitely don't recommend you go about trying to teach your colleagues about the birds and the bees, but you get the point. This is all about teaching other people, and doing so hopefully in a way that's not condescending, hopefully doing so in a way that is genuine and sincere. Again, from our previous lesson, Scheiner, we've checked our biases at the door. Here, step 2, we're seeking to educate other people about what it is that we've learned about our environment. And that's the whole point. That's the whole point. It's easy to get stuck up in certain agendas, but I think it's very important just to kind of break free from those things as much as is humanly possible, right? You can't actually totally divorce yourself from some of these different forces, but to the best of your ability, hey, be the kind of person who's trying to affect positive change by telling people about what you find, and be objective and sincere about what you find. So seek to educate. That's a lesson from Joseph Priestley. Help others see the big picture. All right, let's move on here. Number 3. We're at number 3 of 7, so we're doing good here. William Playfair. This is probably the most famous of all of the 7 pioneers, perhaps, or maybe there's one other maybe who's more famous. But William Playfair was a really colorful figure, right? So if Joseph Priestley was the saint of data visualization, then William Playfair is probably the rogue or the scoundrel. And why do I say that? Well, he was born in Dundee, Scotland. By the way, that's not why I say that. That's a detail about his background. He was born 6 years before Priestley published his chart of biography. So imagine him as a 6-year-old in present-day, Scotland, which then was Scotland as well. And he became, probably as he grew up, aware of Priestley and his work. And actually, we know for a fact he became aware of Priestley and his work because it influenced what Playfair did. But listen to his life. It's a really colorful life. I don't think Carpe Diem was lost on him. He's known as the founder of the graphical methods of statistics, and he's been credited with inventing the bar chart, the line chart, the pie chart, and the circle graph. So that's a lot. He's a very innovative kind of a guy. But he had, like Priestley before him, he was a person who dabbled in just many, many different things. Consider Wikipedia and its description of Playfair. So he was a jack of many trades. He was a fabulous failure in many of those things that he and endeavors he set out to accomplish. He was a millwright. He was a draftsman, an accountant, an inventor, a silversmith, a merchant, an investment broker, an economist, a statistician, a pamphleteer, a translator, a publicist, a land speculator, a convict, a banker, an ardent royalist, an editor, a blackmailer, and a journalist. So that's quite a lot. He obviously lived many, many lives, again, just like our pioneer that we considered before him. He stormed the Bastille, so he was a person who was involved in the center of this, obviously what became the French Revolution. He lived in France for a period in his life, and he lived in sort of the, this community in France rather, where they sort of took up arms, and that was in 1789. So just a guy who was involved with a lot of different things. And if you read the details of some of why he was a convict, for example, or who he tried to blackmail, it's pretty fascinating. But those really aren't why we're going to consider his life, other than just to take note that he was pretty out there. But when it comes to data viz, so this passion, this fervor, this kind of zeal for life resulted in what became known as probably one of the most famous line charts of all time. This is going back, obviously, a few hundred years still, and we know about it today, where he showed the balance of trade between England and a number of other countries. He published the Commercial and Political Atlas, in which he showed a whole host of them. Most of them, in fact, all but one, included this convention that Joseph Priestley invented, which is an x-axis with time going across it on the horizontal axis with even markings and dimensions. And he did this, shading in between of the different lines to give a really dramatic effect, and labeled these areas. This is basically an area chart. So really effective. He actually credited Priestley with employing the same technique, so we can see the influence as we progress through time here. One of the 34 plates in this book, Commercial and Political Atlas, he didn't have enough data. He didn't have the time factor. He only had data for 1 year. So what did he do? He couldn't make a timeline. Well, he made a bar chart. And so he attempted to show that 1 year and the trade, the balance of trade between England and Scotland for that 1 year. And you can see in the description here that he essentially, explains that the reason why he created the chart in this fashion was because he didn't have time. He didn't have that data. So when he was presented with a challenge, or when he, had an obstacle in his way, he innovated around it. Here are a few of the other familiar charts, perhaps, that you've seen. This is from Statistical Breviary in 1801. Basically, it's a pie chart, right? This is looking at the Turkish Empire. This is just a little piece of a broader visualization that includes a number of these types of circles. Here's another one from that same work where you see, again, these circle charts combined with bar charts where you see the before and after effect. Again, looking at the countries in Europe and these different aspects about them, population, the economics. He even tried to use some graphical techniques to increase the visual appeal. Here's a column chart in which he shows agricultural distresses. This is later on. You see he innovated continually, and going forward in 1821, so 20 years, 2 decades after the last ones we just considered, he's got this really kind of fancy title, and he's got shading, and he's got 2 charts on top of one another here. And we can probably get into a debate about whether there are aspects about these visualizations which could be improved upon. But the point is just that he just continued to innovate. He continued to try to find ways to improve and look at things in a visual way. And he left us with this legacy of these really colorful and descriptive charts that go along with his colorful life. Here is a quote, and I think this is important to take note, because we present data in our businesses. We present data if you're a journalist on the web. So what did he say? William Playfair said, "No study is less alluring or more dry and tedious than statistics, unless the mind and imagination are set to work, or that the person studying is particularly interested in the subject, which last can seldom be the case with young men in any rank of life. So a little bit of a humor there, right? But what he's saying is, look, don't count on the other people that you're trying to present to your audience being enthralled and fascinated by the data that you've just spent hours poring over. Take some time. Try to find a way to apply your imagination to the data. And obviously, you could overdo that. Then we need to clearly be very careful about, and we'll consider a little later on here, right? Like not actually manipulating the data, certainly, or even confusing people in an attempt to draw them in with visual appeal. And yet there is the need to apply your imagination. He did. He was very effective. And we remember his charts to this day. So there's something to be said about that. So what was my dedication then to the great William Playfair? Very simply, it was The Temptations and this classic Motown soul record, but it was just my imagination, once again, running away with me. So I guess the point here is in the human experience, right? That's okay. It's okay to have a little bit of imagination and to maybe let things run away with you. Maybe before you go and share your visualization, do a gut check and share with someone else to make sure that your imagination didn't get you too carried away. But yet still, don't take such a dry approach to data and statistics and numbers. The fact of the matter is executives, directors, vice presidents, people in leadership and companies have a very short amount of time to give you to take a look at the data that you have to show them. And if you're a journalist or a blogger, as I am, a blogger, not a journalist, but if you're a blogger, you're trying to share something with the world, they don't really, necessarily love your subject just like you do. So apply your imagination. It's a good lesson. It's worked for me. Again, and just be careful when you do. Next lesson, let's move along here. So use your imagination, and then again, just with Playfair, he just continued to try again. All of his failures never got in his way. Number 4 of 7, Jon Snow, a very famous example here that we're going to consider. In fact, a movie was made of this exact visualization and the circumstances surrounding it. Jon Snow, the father of epidemiology, so this is really getting into health and healthcare and medicine. Well, he was a doctor. Jon Snow was the oldest of 9 children. He was born in 1813 in York, which was not the nicest neighborhood of London, so he had a little bit of a tough upbringing with 8 younger siblings as well as living in sort of rough conditions in London. But he fought through all of that and went on to become an apprentice of a surgeon in Newcastle in 1831. So he went to medical school and he went into practice, again, helping a surgeon. Now, in 1831, he watched cholera wipe out the town of Newcastle. Some ships came into port, the epidemic spread, and it wiped out the town. So he went on, and that was something that affected him. It really left a mark on him. He went on in his life and his career to continue his education. 1850, so going ahead now another 20 years after this cholera epidemic he witnessed, he founded the Epidemiological Society of London. And in 1854, a few days later, there occurred again another outbreak in England in the area that is now known as Broad Street. So this is something that obviously began happening quite often in that time. We know why. In his day, they did not know why. There were a number of theories. The prevailing theory about the spread of cholera was that it was affected by this noxious air or miasma. So it was basically something about the air you breathed that caused you to contract cholera from someone else who had it. So that was what all the kind of the experts and the establishment in the medical community at that time were pretty sure about that. But he didn't know. He wasn't sure. Now, what was going on in that area, and it's not pleasant to think about it. In fact, it's the reason why I got out of civil engineering in my college days is, you look at the sewage system and it wasn't ready. It hadn't reached these neighborhoods within London. And so you basically had, horrible conditions. Basements were cesspools. And so this outbreak occurred. Now, consider the facts here. August 31st, 1854, the outbreak hits. 127 deaths in 3 days. By September 10th, 500 people had died. And importantly, the mortality rate for those who contracted the disease was 12.8%. So more than 1 in 10 who contracted it died of it. And by the end, there were over 600 who had died of this particular epidemic. So he was very skeptical of this miasma theory, this bad air. And so what he did is he actually walked around, and so he had been developing this theory. There's a lot of myths about this example. He had been developing this theory for some time. But what he did, and again, this sounds easy to say, but he walked door to door in the middle of a cholera outbreak, right in the area where it was hit the hardest and the worst, and knocked on doors, asked people how many had contracted the disease and died in their homes. So this was not a pleasant endeavor that he went about. Next time, you complain or feel, as I do, that you went through a whole lot of difficulty obtaining data, just remember Jon Snow. It didn't involve the potential of contracting cholera, nor did it involve speaking with distraught individuals. So he did the down and dirty work here. He rolled up the sleeves. He went right to the source. He was able to create this map of the cholera outbreak in that area, and you can see the little dark blocks there. They represent how many people had died of the disease in that particular home. And so what it showed very clearly, which he took to the authorities, was that there was this concentration of people who died in the area closest to the Broad Street pump. And as you get farther away from the Broad Street pump, you had fewer deaths. As you went closer to places where there was a more convenient water pump to use, then the deaths went down. There was a monastery right across from the Broad Street pump with 0 deaths. And so this was an interesting finding. Why would, the theory was that if you're closer to the pump, you're more likely to die. But here's this outlier, right? And so instead of just scratching his head and moving away, he went to the monastery and he found out that they brew their own beer, so they didn't drink the water from the pump. So a good lesson there. I guess I wouldn't necessarily extrapolate that forward, that it's better to drink beer than water, but it certainly was for the individuals and the inhabitants of the monastery. So again, there's more evidence for his theory that it was the water. It was weird, it's so easy for us to take that for granted, that water, even though it may look perfectly clear, even though it may not smell bad, might have something in it that can kill us. Like, that was not anything that made any sense to them, but he was able to use data to show it. And he, did so by really, again, rolling up his sleeves and collecting the data the best way he knew how. Here's what he said. I love this quote. He wrote a letter to one of his peers in the medical community, and he said, "You and I may not live to see the day, and my name may be forgotten when it comes, but the time will arrive when great outbreaks of cholera will be things of the past, and it is the knowledge of the way in which the disease is propagated which will cause them to disappear." Well, we do remember his name, and he was right in the sense that great outbreaks of cholera, at least in the civilized world, has been, for the most part, eradicated. It still does sadly remain in certain parts of the world, and so his techniques and what he learned all that time ago can still be applied in certain parts of the world. However, in the civilized world, it's pretty much gotten taken care of, and it's because of the work he did. So the lesson from Dr. Jon Snow is to go to the source. Before joining Tableau, I was a master black belt at Medtronic, and I learned this lean methodology, and this is one of their principal tenets, is to go to the Gemba, right? Don't take for granted the data that someone emailed you, and don't sit in your cubicle or don't connect to that database and assume you know what's going on. There's lots of stories that I could tell, and you probably know them as well, of problems that arose because people didn't understand the way the data was collected itself, or how it was processed, or how it came to be in the state that it was in when they received it. So it's important to go to the source. My dedication to Dr. Snow is a song by Frankie Valli, and it goes like this: "I'm going to walk like a man, fast as I can, walk like a man to the Broad Street pump." So he did that. He got out there, he walked, he hustled, he did what he needed to do to collect the data, to tell the story, and to convince others about what it was that he had come to believe. And oh, by the way, it had a major impact, saved countless lives, and is something that we benefit from in today's day and age. So we're glad he got out there. We're glad he knocked on doors and took down the notes, and we're glad that he showed it in a visual way, in such a way that we can never forget it. So great lesson there from Dr. Jon Snow. All right, number 5, we'll move right along here. Florence Nightingale, the lady with the lamp. So Florence Nightingale was a woman. She lived in England, and she was a nurse. She's basically known as the founder of modern day nursing. Actually, they have the Nightingale Pledge, which nurses go through to when they're done with their schooling. So she's the founder of modern nursing. The lady with the lamp, she served in the British Army and in the Crimean War, and so she went to Turkey. And she was actually a young girl who grew up in a very affluent family in England, and had a lot of suitors, very wealthy, trying to court her, and yet she felt that it was her calling to not get married and settle down to a comfortable life in England, but rather to pack her bags and head on out to a place of, again, like Jon Snow, right, a place of absolute misery. So she would go to the hospitals in the field, the English Army hospitals, and there would be really miserable conditions, men lying in the corridors, similar to Jon Snow's day, even though it was later on. They still had just cesspools underneath the hospital floor, a total lack of sanitation going on there. And so she was known just for her incredible compassion. She was known for her dedication. She was actually also a lover of numbers and math, and she credits her father with teaching her about math and mathematical topics when she was a young girl, and she carried that love forward into her role as a nurse. Now you would say, well, it's not a nurse's job to collect data, it's a nurse's job to just take care of soldiers, but yet she thought outside the box. She didn't just accept that maybe what would be a typical series of activities and tasks for a nurse, but she actually added to it this collection of data. And she became sort of a celebrity in England for her heroics working in the field and helping these soldiers, and she was well loved by them, and so she sort of became a national hero. And so she was asked by Queen Victoria at the time to conduct a sort of a sanitary commission, and she showed Queen Victoria these very famous charts today. These are what she called her coxcomb plots, and they're basically polar charts. They show around a circle here, every slice being a different month of a specific year in the 1800s. And what they're showing is the mortality of the soldiers in the hospital, in this field hospital. So then the colors of the different sections of the wedges are what they died of. So in red, these are basically deaths in the field in combat, active combat. Black would be another similar type of kind of wound, so where they got wounded and died later of their affliction. And then the blue slice, this large chunk here that goes all the way around, is actually deaths in the hospital due to preventable or natural causes, disease. And so what you can immediately see is that, for the most part, soldiers are dying because they're getting sick. They're not dying because they're getting killed in battle. And furthermore, you're seeing this sort of spike in deaths in January and February, so in the colder months. Again, and they didn't really know why. I mean, this is something that just happened, and so she really investigated it, found that as the winter months came, people would huddle more and more due to the temperatures, and so you would have the spread of disease, and it sparked this kind of reform to improve the conditions in these areas, and so it led to this sweeping reform, right? So because of her work here, the Queen sent sort of this sanitation commission to Turkey, and once that happened, the mortality rate dropped from 52% to 20%. She became, for these heroics, the first female member of the Royal Society of Statistics. And with regard to these charts and why she made them, she had a mentor who was a statistician who felt that you needed to just show the numbers in pure dry form in tables, but she was pretty passionate and believed that you needed to show them in visual form. And she said that a quote that I'll read before reading these quotes is that she wanted to affect through the eyes what we fail to convey to the public through their word-proof ears. So basically, she felt that if I just said something, people aren't going to listen. But if I showed them, they would have to take action. And she said, I attribute my success to this. I never gave or took any excuse. And then she went on to say how very little can be done under the spirit of fear. So she was just this bold person, She just kind of went out there and did this amazing work. So my dedication to Florence Nightingale is probably, I bet you this song is on K-Earth 101 now. It wasn't when I was a little kid. It's from the 80s. And It's called The Eye of the Tiger by Survivor. So she had this Eye of the Tiger. She went out there and she got it done. And so my dedication to her with the lyrics, if I were to change it, it would be rising up straight to the top, had the guts, got the glory, went the distance, now I'm not going to stop. Just a woman and her will to convince. So she definitely did that. Oh, by the way, we're getting all nostalgic here. This is a reason why. Can you think of another song that includes the phrase "the eye of the tiger"? And now we know that, we get this kind of misty look in our eye when we think about how things used to be and how much better they used to be. So I definitely feel the Survivor version of "Eye of the Tiger" is far, far better than the one that you can find today. So okay, that's the lesson of Florence Nightingale. To reiterate, no excuses, no fear. Don't let anyone get in your way. Lots of people wanted her to not do what she did. She went to the highest possible authority in the entire world at that time, Queen Victoria, and she didn't bat an eyelash. And so how many times do you have the opportunity to speak or present to individuals in a position of influence and authority in the world that you live in? Hey, go for it and have the eye of the tiger like Florence Nightingale did. All right, let's move along here. Number 6 of 7 is Charles Joseph Menard. So we have time for Q&A. I'll pick up the pace a little here. Menard, he is one of the more recent examples. This is actually going into the 1800s. So he lived in France. He was actually not a cartographer, although we're going to see he created a very famous map. He was actually a civil engineer. He built bridges, waterways, railways later on in his career. He was involved in his professional life with the transportation of things over land and sea. And so that's sort of what he did. He was actually very successful at it. He was, he led the French Canal and harbor engineering. He was a distinguished superintendent and professor and inspector of this school in Paris. So his studies always centered, though, around the construction of these canals, ports, railways. In their infancy, he established the field, really. He started, and so after he more or less retired, if we take a look at when this was created in his life, Menard created. So remember, take a look at the dates real quick here. 1781 to 1870. So he lived to be about 90. 1870, lived to be a good old age. He died in 1870. Look when he published his map. 1869. You've probably seen this map. He was 1 year before he died. It's almost like he decided at the end of his life, he did all this work, and he decided at the end of his life, oh, by the way, I'm going to leave you something that you'll never forget. And so he went to create this map. What it shows, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is a very doomed and sort of dreaded campaign here. Napoleon's army starting on the left with the beige bar and marching on Moscow, and as the thickness of the line gets narrower and narrower, basically that shows the surviving army members within his troop. And they just dwindle down to literally 2%. The black line showing the return as they retreated out of Moscow back to France. You see how small that army became. And you've seen this. We've seen it a lot. We know Tufte spoke of it as probably the greatest visualization of all time. You can see a whole lot of data in here if you look really carefully and closely, including the temperature of the return across the bottom in the line plot. But he applied. You can see exactly why he was the right person to make something like this. Cartographers in his day didn't care about it. They ignored it. It was not anything that they wanted to look at, and they totally ignored it. He was not someone who was an expert cartographer, so his map was ignored. And yet his map is the most enduring, probably, from his generation. And he was a uniquely positioned individual to create a map just like this. Instead of water going, instead of goods going across water or land, he's looking at an army and the size of that army as it progresses across the terrain. He was uniquely positioned in his life with his perspective to be able to create a map just like this. He did others. He showed another map, less dramatic perhaps, but this is Hannibal's raid. He made this in the same year. You can see the same kind of a thing as Hannibal and his army raid Italy, and the size of that army as it gets smaller and smaller, and some of the dramatic drops as it goes across some of these mountain passes and riverways. Here is a quote by Menard. He said, "The aim of my carte figurative," or the maps that he made, "is less to express statistical results, better done by numbers, than to convey promptly to the eye the relation not given quickly by numbers requiring mental calculation." And there you see in one easy little quote, the reason why data viz is so big today, because you can convey a whole lot more if you give something to the eye to see instead of just a table of numbers. This is why data viz is so great. My lesson, though, from Menard isn't that data viz is great. It isn't to make really cool maps. It's actually to apply your unique perspective. And, by the way, it's better late than never. So he waited till very late in his life to give this map we'll never forget. But again, it was something he was uniquely positioned to do. He had a whole career in civil engineering, and so he knew a good way to do this, to show this history, and he was able to apply that. A lot of times people are shy about what they want to say, but I think it's important, especially when I encourage people to start blogging their interests in data visualization. It's always, and the message I give them is, there's something about your background that's different than mine. You may be, for example, fluent in finance. You're going to have perspectives that an engineer doesn't have. Even your hobbies, you may be, an avid outdoors man or woman, and you're going to have a perspective about nature that's going to be something you can translate and use as a strength as you apply your own unique perspective. So I encourage you, and my dedication here to Menard is the words of a song by Bill Withers, and it's a very simple one. Actually, it's probably the simplest set of lyrics here. And it goes on, and Bill Withers says, and I know, and he goes on like that. And I guess the point is, you know things that I don't know. You're an expert in things that I am not an expert in. And so if you can apply that, if you can find a way to show me something that you can uniquely be aware of, then we can all benefit. So again, great lesson there from Menard. Next, let's move along here before I give Q&A. This is the one that the pioneer that time almost forgot. Luckily for us, Google didn't forget him, and in fact, if you're not a celebrity, you can take solace in the fact that Google also will find you, because Google took his book and they scanned it. It was one of the dusty shelf books somewhere as they scanned books in, and now we can all know the genius of Willard Coplin. So let's consider who he was. 1880, and he's the one who lived into the 20th century, 1951. Basically, he wrote two very amazing books, Graphical Methods for Presenting Facts and Graphic Presentation. You can find these. If you do a Google book search, you will find them. And it's pretty amazing here that if you look at some of his examples, right, he is talking to our day about infographics and the scourge of some of these cartoony type visualizations that really don't convey much of anything, and he speaks very harshly of them. In fact, he even talks about bar charts and how they could be improved upon. Here's some photos from his book. Again, this is going back. He's a draftsman. These are made by hand. It's so easy to just click some buttons and have a map. He made these by hand on a table with pen and ink. Willard Coplin, I love this quote, "As the cathedral is to its foundation, so is an effective presentation of facts to the data. And one of a businessman's chief assets is his ability to show things to others in their true proportions." So my lesson from Brinton, and let me get to Q&A now, and this is an important one because we talked a lot about imagination and we talked a lot about passion. Yes, those are important, but also at the very end, make sure that we respect the data. Make sure that we keep things in their proper proportions, that any attempt to add visual appeal doesn't mangle the true message in the data and take away from the accuracy of what it is that we're conveying. And by the way, don't worry if anyone knows your name. Again, Google will remember all of us, and people down the road will all be able to see exactly what it is that we did. So maybe that's a good thing or not. But here we go, and I'm sorry, let's just talk about my dedication to Menard. Is Aretha Franklin song, and that goes simply RESPECT. Find out what it means to your business. So show respect to the data. Make sure that what you're showing people is accurate, is making use of all of the visual sort of cognition and what we do well and versus what we don't do well. Okay, so wrapping it up and then Q&A. Here are our 7 pioneers, including Menard here, but our lessons: explore with an open mind, seek to educate, use your imagination, go to the source, no excuses, no fear, apply your unique perspective, and respect the data. So with that, and with just about a few minutes left here, I'd like to turn it over to Tim and see if we can answer a couple important questions.
Great. Thanks, Ben. That was really well done. Informative, funny, loved the references to pop culture. You did a great job. So we do have just a few minutes to squeeze in some questions. The first one, by the way, thank you to the audience. And just as a note, everybody that is viewing, you can see Ben's email address on the slide. You can take that down. If you have other questions following the event today, you can reach out to him directly. So the first question is, you've shown a lot of examples of historical data visualization. Is there a way in Tableau to store templates that you can use from many different data sets?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are ways to update and have color palettes, for example, particular to your organization. And you can, I would refer you to the Tableau forums, and there's some great posts there on how you can add color templates. And so usually the best thing with templates, though, I've found, is to actually create a workbook that has all of the fonts and colors and line weights, and just have that saved as sort of a template, what we call a TWIBX file in Tableau speak, so a TWBX. So you have that workbook. When you open it up, it's got pretty much all of the settings that you want. And so it's usually pretty simple, but it is important to start with a workbook that has all of the settings. If they're going to be common across your projects, we see this a lot with journalists, right? If you're at the USA Today, or if you're, wherever you are, you've got a set of brand guidelines around how